Awareness Podcast, a place where we collect stories and circulate life-changing wisdom. I'm your host, Asher, and our guest today is Dan Mamone. Got that one right. And today's theme is around first-time experiences. That's what we talk about on Mondays. Monday's theme is first-time experiences, where we get to just share our journey, the stuff we've been through for the first time that people might find useful and valuable. So if you're here because we get to talk about first-time experience, and Don gonna share us a lot with us today about his first-time experience throughout life. And Don, if you don't mind, give us a bit about yourself, where you're hailing from, what you specialize in, how you adding
Yes.
value to the world, and who you've been a hero to, my friend.
Oh my gosh, that's so many questions. Hi, Asher.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me here. I'm Don Mamone. My pronouns are they, them, and I am an author, a speaker. I'm an identity coach. My wife and I own a photography business, so I feel like I'm a lot of things to a lot of people. To answer your question about where I'm from, I don't know how far you want me to go back, so I'll just give you the synopsized version of it. I am a hospitality veteran or survivor, however you want to look at that. I used to work in hotels for about 10 years. And then, I loved everything about it right up until I didn't. And so I decided I was going to do something else. My wife and I at that time decided to start a photography business, and we've been entrepreneurs for about the last 17 years. And
Nice.
more recently, I have moved from my passion, which I consider to be photography, into my purpose, which I believe is using the spoken and written word to inspire people to love themselves unconditionally and to live their lives unapologetically. And I got to say it, and you'll hear a little bit more about it depending on what kind of anecdotes we talk about today. But the hero that I want to be and the person I want to be that hero to is my daughter. I have a 7.5-year-old daughter, and she
Nice.
is just so much part of everything I do.
Wow. Congratulations on being a hero to that young lady. Make sure that
Thank you.
she's seeing value in the world. Okay, folks. Well, if you're listening right now, go ahead and put hashtag live in the chat. If you're catching this on replay, go ahead and put hashtag replay in the chat. And let's get this going. So, Don,
Yes.
I'm sure you got plenty of first-time experiences that the world needs to know about.
Yeah.
Which one will you tell them first?
So one of my favorites
Mm-hmm.
is a mess of happy, sad, painful, hopeful, joyful, and it is the nexus or the sort of origin story around an idea that I have that everybody has a coming out story. And as you can imagine, when you talk about a coming out story, that is a first time for most people, a lot of times. And it's oftentimes associated with the LGBTQIA2 plus community. But what I've done is in my journey, I've realized everybody's got a moment in their life, Asher, where they say, this fear gets to be courage, this doubt gets to be certainty,
Mm-hmm.
this shame gets to be pride, and I'm just going to be who I am for the whole world to see. And I first did that in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been married to Emily for 7 years. I had a 9-month-old daughter who's now 7.5, as I mentioned. And I decided to say that it is no longer okay for me to take something that I know of myself and hide it and deny it because I have a 9-month-old daughter and I get to teach her and be a role model for her. And if I'm not the role model that shows her that she can be anything she wants, do anything she wants, love anybody she wants, and do that out in the open and with a great deal of pride, then I was going to teach her the opposite, because you know how kids are. If you're a parent out there and you're listening, you know that you can tell them all day long, but most of the time they learn by seeing, by watching, by feeling. And so I told my wife for the first time, there's something different about me. I've known it since I was a kid. I was too afraid to be who I am, and I need to figure what that means. And I hope that you'll go on that journey with me. And we'll talk about her a lot, I'm sure, today. But
Mm-hmm.
I won the karmic lottery. I don't know how I found the wife that I found, but she said, "You're my person, and I love you forever, and let's do it." So here we
Well,
are.
well, that's incredible, by the way.
Thank you.
It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing, by the way.
Thank
And the
you.
reason I say that because my oldest brother, I'm gonna talk about. I hope he doesn't mind me talking about it here. But my oldest brother, for years, I didn't know that he was gay, right? And then coming from a Jamaican background, like very, very homophobic, so forth and so on. But I was thinking about just the idea of like coming out and saying that that's what it is, how much courage it take. I
Mm-hmm.
was like, man, if you take that much courage to come out and say this thing, knowing that how much people are gonna like and dislike you, right? That you don't have that emotional freedom to say what you like and what you don't like, right? But once you come out with it, how much courage it take, and then from there, that kind of courage put into other things in your life, how powerful that could be, because not a lot of people can do it. So
Hmm.
going back to your first time experience coming out, so what was the conversation like after you kind of shared that story about yourself?
Oh, what a great question. It was interesting because I I searched for who I was in the world,
Hmm.
and I never found myself. So I like to tell the story. I'm a Gen X kid. I grew up in the '80s and early '90s. I graduated from college at the late '90s, and throughout that time, I knew there was something different about me, and I sought it out for clarity. And some of my favorite examples in the '80s where there were people that sort of embodied the idea of gender nonconformity, but they were rock stars, Like, what little kid living in the southern state looks up at David Bowie or Annie Lennox or Boy George or Prince and was like, oh, there I am. Like, that's totally me, somebody who doesn't want to play by the rules and knows that I'm somebody different inside. I just felt like, well, that's so cool that they're able to have that freedom, that they've accepted who they are and they're out rocking it, quite literally.
Hmm.
And it just didn't fit. It didn't match. And so until later in my life, and when I say later in my life, I mean like much later, into my late 30s and early 40s, when the idea of gender identity and gender expression became more sort of ubiquitous, it became more popular and people started talking about it, was when I said, okay, well, maybe this is what I really am, even though I still can't talk about it. And then
Hmm.
it was my daughter. It really was the birth of my daughter. I took my wife to a park. I tell the story somewhat dramatically when I do it from stage. I build up a lot of anticipation, but it's very true. I kept trying to tell her, Asher, and I would choke on the words, because to say something like this, like you referenced to your brother, not knowing what the response would be,
Hmm.
it's a exercise in abject vulnerability. Like, you are literally putting yourself out there. You're going to say the words. There's no way to take them back. Once they're out, you just get to be prepared for how it's received. And so I took her to a park in Texas in the middle of August because it was sort of a place that we would just go and walk around. Although not that time of year, I was like, hey, let's go to the park and have a chat. And during that time, I did the best I could to explain to her who I believed that I was.
Hmm.
I didn't have the language. I didn't have the representation. I couldn't look at her and say, well, Emily, I believe myself to be either gender nonconforming or non binary, and I'd like to explain to you what that means. It
Hmm.
was more like the sobbing, ugly tears of, there's something different about me. I've always believed that there's both male and female, or masculine and feminine in me, and I get to explore that, and I want to allow the world to know the whole and the entirety of me. And like I said, the karmic lottery, somehow that's what I won. And there were questions she asked, and there was a lot of uncertainty. But the one thing she said she was certain of was that she knew I was her person. She knew that we got to go on this journey together. She knew that she was going to love me forever. And it was kind of one foot in front of the other, no idea where exactly it was headed, but just knowing that we were on that path together. And that was it.
Hmm. Listen to you talk about, I was thinking just now about sometimes we gotta go all the way back to the spiritual identity piece, right? And figure out what that spiritual identity is and then come back. Because personally, I think, society, what they do is they lock you into your color and trap
Mm-hmm.
you there. They lock you into your gender and trap you there. They lock into your religion, trap you there. All these different labels, they lock you in there and trap you there. But then realize that if you think about it, like you and I, we are above the organization of sex, the organization of color, the organization of gender, so forth and so on. Once you realize that my spiritual identity is above all those were organizations that was the use of the label to kind of identify with people. Then I'm like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
so now if I'm above all these organizations, then how do I see myself now? Like, what am I really? And
Mm.
when I go back to my spiritual identity, I realize, okay, Asher, who are you? So if I ask you the question, if you're made up of the highest and the lowest ingredients, right? People might say, I don't know if you're religious, they might say, oh, God is in you. Okay, so if God is in me and I'm made up of the highest and the lowest ingredient, which one would I identify with?
Mm-hmm.
Most likely the highest ingredients, right? So that make me what? An expression of God, universe, source, Gus. So then I go back to that identity piece and figure, okay, I'm above all these organizations. So what does that make me? More powerful in the world. So
Yeah.
then what are your thoughts when you think about that?
So I would consider myself, I guess, spiritual. I
Hmm.
believe in higher powers. I've
Hmm.
actually been reading a lot and absorbing a lot, and kind of been on this path of kind of faith and spirituality. And um, I believe what a lot of people lack is faith in themselves, and
Hmm.
and faith in their agency to make choice. and to choose to be who they are rather than do what the world expects of them. I think one of the most important things that you just said, first of all, you said it so beautifully, and thank you for that. The most important thing that you said to me is how you see yourself.
Mm,
And whether you see a higher being in yourself like God or Buddha or Allah
mhm,
or whatever moves you to be the best version of yourself, the most authentic version of yourself, I'm here for it and I want to support you in that, right? It's interesting to me because I feel like when we see ourselves, we don't need a label.
mm,
We literally can define ourselves by sort of the wholeness of who we know ourselves to be. The problem becomes then when we try to fit into other people's systems.
mhm,
Asher, I've been working on a lot what I consider persistent content. So I've been pouring a lot of my thoughts and ideas into a draft document that will be my best selling first ever effort at writing a book. First,
mhm,
not only. And one of the things that I've spent a considerable amount of time on is this concept of, well, if I'm me and I get to be me and
mhm,
I meet someone, let's call them George, on the street, and George's system isn't prepared to process me. Unfortunately, we live in a world where George's expectation or my offer to them is, okay, well, I'll just change myself or relabel myself or do what I need to do in order to fit into your system.
mm,
And by system, I mean their world beliefs, the things that they've known, that they trust, that they believe. And that's problematic because if I try to conform to each individual's person of how they expect to see me, I will never be, as you say, like the best, most purest, highest level ingredient of myself, literally ever. And
mhm,
so I think what it means is when I meet people, I've replaced expectation and judgment with curiosity. And I think of my system as ever expanding. Oh, I'm so sorry, George. I've met you now, and I don't know that I have a bucket. I'm using the podcast air quotes for those of you that are listening. Like, I don't have a bucket for you, but I want to know you and get to know you and read you and understand you and respect you exactly how you are, not how it fits what I already know to be true. And when that system becomes that adaptable, I believe that that's when you can meet people where they're at and get to know them and love them for exactly who they are with no change. Does that make sense?
Yes. Wow. I love where this conversation is going, by the way. This is very, I love depth. And you got me thinking about, we often try to, let me go with that this way. You know, when they teach you in school, they often teach about, like, I think every class in school fall under the umbrella of history. Nobody's in school teach you about the future. You can't teach the future because oftentimes we need a reference point. So when somebody's having a conversation, oftentimes they're going to reference you to something they already know for them to make sense of you.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes I understand has to be a reference for me to actually understand you, but then I gotta get to know you.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I see you for the first time, never hear you speak, never hear you say anything, all I'm gonna do is I'm only gonna see your features. So someone
Mm-hmm.
asks me, who's Don? I'm like, well, Don looks like this, he acts like this, whatever. But I don't know Don's story because until I know your story, because the benefits of you is in your story,
Mm-hmm.
not just the features. So if I don't understand the story, I get to know you. I'm like, okay, now I understand who Don is now because I hear his story. I hear his first time experiences. I hear his failures. I hear his fears. I hear his needs. I hear his victory. All those things give me an idea who Don is. So now I can actually make a better reference to who Don is versus me just going by the features. So I
Mm-hmm.
say, there's this quote that says, I'm a butcher a little bit, but it's saying that there's no one you can actually hate if you really get to know their story.
Mm-hmm.
If you really get to understand that story, you can't hate them because if you was in that same situation, going through that same thing, what would you do differently? Most likely, probably do the same thing because that's all the information you have. So I think about it through those lenses when I think about your story. So what are your thoughts?
I do not disagree with you. If you're going to make sense and be logical and be open-minded and open-hearted, it's really hard for me to disagree with you, Asher. So I think it's so beautiful when you think about the idea of getting to know someone. But I
Mhm,
also want to talk about knowing based on what we believe that we know. And when I say we, I'm using sort of the royal we, right? We as humans have this tendency to be like, well, I know this thing. And I think that that opens the opportunity for problem because when we say I know this thing and we kind of check the box and are like, okay, I don't need to learn any more about that, we don't understand and accept and acknowledge that there is a certain fluidity and progression to what we truly know. And let's use just a couple of concrete examples from my life. But first, let's look at history, right? I was just writing about this the other day. When we think that we know something, and then we go through our life sort of blissfully ignorant of the things that we can continue to learn about that subject, problems ensue, right? And so we think all the way back to like 400 BC, we knew that we had a geocentric universe, which meant that the Earth was at the center of all these celestial orbits going around the Earth. Right up until like 2,000 years later, when somebody came along and said, listen, I know that was an effort on your part and I really appreciate you. But now that we have some of the more, intricate knowledge of these things, and we have mathematicians and scientists, we realize that actually all the celestial bodies are going around the sun. So we have like a solar centric universe. No, 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 no. You have people that want to say, I don't need to learn any more about that. Someone once told me that we are a geocentric space, right? The same thing about the atom, right? We thought the atom was the smallest particle of matter until someone got a microscope and saw that there was electrons in there. And then we split it open and proved it. Like, life has a way of progressing. And if we think that we know everything about people or a person, then that's how our systems become static. And so I want you to get to know me. And when, like you said, you get to know me, you get to know my story, but you also get to learn more about relative things. And the story in my world is I meet a lot of people, especially in sort of the more, I think, conventional and conservative spaces in the country, that believe that gender is a binary. They fundamentally and categorically say you're either a boy or a girl. Doesn't matter the science, doesn't matter the articles written, doesn't matter the resources, doesn't matter that I stand right before them and say, I just really would love to open your eyes and your heart to the idea of gender on a spectrum, and to tell you that I know who I am the same way you know who you are. When I ask someone, how do you know you're a man or you're male or you identify as male or man, they say, I just know. Great, cool. I'm the same exact way, right? And so damned be the proof. I know what I know. And so I think that your comment of like, get to know the person and keep your life open to know the things that you just haven't learned yet, it gets rid of one of the biggest complications in life, and that's ignorance, right? Which is just the absence of knowledge or experience.
Speaking of ignorance, oh yeah, there's a lot we don't know, and the more we know, we realize there's a lot more we do not know. So going back, okay, so we gotta switch gear, figure out, okay, what else that you want to share about another first-time experiences that you've had. And you mentioned talking about the writing and the book, and you talk about the challenges of actually thinking up your thinking vocabulary, speaking vocabulary, and writing vocabulary. Put
Yeah.
those three out there. Talk to me about that journey.
It's interesting that you bring that up because, again, you so succinctly and so beautifully stated, like, there's certain things that we're good at or certain things that sort of come naturally to us. For me, that's speaking. When I'm on a stage, I feel like I'm in my purpose. And I say there's a great deal of humility and pride at the same time, Asher, because, I'm not one of those people just go around kind of tooting my own horn. But it was about a year ago, I was giving a talk, and we had a video team kind of asking people what they thought of this 2-hour-long talk workshop facilitation. It was about authenticity. It wasn't necessarily about gender identity and diversity, although I talk about that as well. It was about how do you start being who you are and stop doing what you think you're supposed to be doing? Like, how do you step fully into that freedom to be who you are? And I'll never forget that I realized that I had accomplished one of my biggest, most important goals. The person said, when I was listening to Don talk from the stage, I believed that they were talking directly to me the entire time. And when I had the pleasure of talking to them after the fact, I felt like I was the only person in the room. And seeing people and interacting with people in that way is so much of what I want to create in this world and help people learn, is that commitment, that presence, that intention, that deep focus. Writing has been a little harder for me. And I recently just shared with the world a one-line saying that I think is so much of it. When I found myself, I believe I found my voice. And so I've got a 41 or 45 year catching up to do. I always spoke from a place of my heart, but when I would write, I believe that I would write what I thought people wanted to hear, what I thought people wanted me to write in the way that I thought I was supposed to write. It was very clinical. It was very robotic. My brother-in-law was one of the first people that ever read something I wrote and said, I don't hear you in this. It's a great article, but I can't find you in this. And for the past 4 months of this writing exercise, I really feel like I've found that voice. And so let's get back to the first time and answer your actual question.
Mhm.
I think every time we break out from that place that we're comfortable, the thing that breaks us down, the things that stop us is fear.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of people in the world that look for that place of no fear. I just don't want to be afraid anymore. And I tell them that fear is the most amazing thing on the planet, and you should welcome it and hold it close to you, because fear means you're pushing past what you're comfortable with or what you're really good at, so that you can get excellent at something, so that you can be a genius at something, so that you can literally step fully into your purpose. It's the fragility that we need to eliminate.
Mm.
There are so many people in this world that are like, well, I can't do that. I shouldn't do that. I'm not supposed to do that. No one expects that of me. That's one of my favorite, actually. I had a client that I was coaching through starting a new personal brand. She'd been like a titan of industry and really crazy successful as an entrepreneur, but she wanted to have this personal brand to help people traverse some of the things that she traversed. And I said, why do you talk about these specific things? Well, that's what everybody expects me to talk about.
Mm.
I'm like, but what do you want to talk about? And after a couple sessions, she was like, I don't want to talk about any of those things. I'm like, yeah, give them everything they don't expect. And she's like, yeah. And before you
Mhm.
knew it, she had a completely new curriculum of speeches that she was prepared to give. And she was writing on Medium, and she was showing up as her authentic self. And it was so beautiful. So I think that we get to remember that every time we do something for the first time, it's going to be awkward. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be laden with fear, and you're going to do it anyway.
Mm. I love when you reference your friend, going back to her personal brand. I think the personal brand is like a very difficult one to kind of like go into, because that insecurity piece shows up. I remember, so my first book that I wrote, it was more about like all of the system tools and great thinking that I kind of discovered from reading a lot of books. And I kind of put out the next, after that, I put out a guided journal, kind of work with that book a little bit. But then I wrote another book, a manuscript, and I turned it into my editor. And it
Mm-hmm.
was another same on the same level where there's a lot of systems and tools. And she was like, Asher, this is great information, Asher. But what about your story?
Mm-hmm.
And that question, she probably could have asked us that question like a couple years back, and I probably like, But in that moment, that question was so powerful. In that moment, it was a perfect question for her to ask me after I turned in a manuscript. I was
Mm-hmm.
like, I know. I don't think I'm ready for write my story. She was like, no, Asher, I think the world needs to know your story now. And in that moment, I had to start all over again, go back to the drawing board. I'm like, okay, let me go start figure out how can I write my story now. And it was very liberating, because now from that journey, I start going back in my own story, studying my own past. Because they were saying that those who study the past are masters of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Those who study their past are masters of their future. Right. So now I'm like, okay, I gotta go back into my own story now. I gotta increase the value of it. I gotta
Mm-hmm.
go back there and pick the things out of it that I think I'm ready to share, and I can start sharing it. And it was very empowering, man. That was like the best thing she could have asked me to do in that moment, is to write my story. So I started working on it. And now it's actually, that book is coming out in 21 May. And then it also gave me a vision like, okay, now I need to figure out how can I have other people do the same.
Mm-hmm.
So then I start working. And so actually I'm start putting together a group of immigrants to write their own story, because I know the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're there to go on this journey to follow their dream, to chase their dream, to act on their dream. But then oftentimes they accomplish a lot of things, but they don't feel like they're still adding value. Like there's nothing value in my story. I'm like, no, you've done a lot. Same with me. Like I joined the military, I did a lot of stuff like move around, but I didn't feel like I did anything impactful, because it was just my story. And after I went back to it, I'm like, you know what? Let me start writing this. And after I start doing that, I'm appreciate my past like a stock. It's going up in value now, because I start looking at it differently and try to find things from it that I can use to appreciate the future I'm gonna move into. What are your thoughts?
It's amazing to me that it's amazing to me how people underestimate their contribution and their value and their worth. So
Mm,
two anecdotes come to mind. I was coaching somebody, and I was trying to help them see themselves not as who they are, but as to sort of their worth, their value, their contribution. And um, it was in that moment that I kept telling them, they use the word just a
mm,
lot. I'm just this, I'm just that.
mm,
And just by doing that, they were literally lowering the estimations of what they were contributing to the world around them. And so I help them, I can coach them. And then I realized that both in my career as a photographer and in my career as a mentor and as a coach, people had this tendency to do what I call internalizing criticism and externalizing praise.
Mm,
They consistently play down and sort of limit their belief in their contributions or how they look or how they feel or what they've done, and they do the exact opposite to the people around them. In
mm,
photo shoots, it would be two people looking at their own photos and saying the meanest, harshest, most unflattering things, and then looking at their friends and saying the nicest, kindest, most wonderful things. And I thought, boy, if you walked up to somebody and said to them what you just said to yourself,
mm-hmm,
you'd have no friends and they might likely punch you in the face. Like, it was
mm-hmm,
that dramatic. And then when it comes to contributions, when it comes to parents, when it comes to immigrants, when it comes to veterans, when it comes to basically anybody I've ever interacted with, I very rarely find them ever properly estimating and being proud of their contribution. And one of the ways that this plays itself out endlessly, Asher, is when you pay someone a compliment
mm,
and they brush it off, or they say, oh no, it was nothing. I got two responses that I teach the people that I work with, how they respond to a compliment. You're right, it's true, or you're not wrong. Like, those are your two responses, right? You look beautiful
yeah.
today. Honey, you're not wrong. Like, I look great today. I put a lot of work into how I look and I feel really, really proud of it. And you might want to use the first one, which is a little bit more humbled, and the other one, which is a little snarky, depending on who you're with. But
Mm-hmm.
when I'm with my people and they pay me a nice compliment, I'm like, you're not wrong. And they laugh and
Yeah.
I feel good, as opposed to, oh no, it's nothing. It really is something. You're something.
Wow. I think you are onto something here when it comes to the self-edification, because we don't do a lot of that to ourselves. And it's sometimes it's good to be around people too that kind of edify you a bit, because oftentimes we're not good practice at it for ourselves. And that's something that we gotta learn. Like, you're right, we gotta learn that, doing that. Hey, I've done enough to warrant me being here. But sometimes we're like, I haven't done enough, I haven't done enough, I haven't done enough. And that goes back into, hey, I'm not good enough for the things I've done, because hey, everybody's doing it. Well, if you take your stuff out of the picture, what will be missing? Something will be missing.
Mm-hmm.
But then we don't see that. Like, oh yeah, it's not. So I'm telling you, like, I'm learning this journey myself, because I realized that even in the military, a lot of things I've accomplished, I didn't really thought it was much. And after I left the community, I'm like, okay, what next now, Asher? Like, you was in that system. That system made you great, but what can you be out of that system? Can you still be great too? I had to start thinking about what I've done. Like, can I go back out here and create a system for myself to be great, and use that system to help other people be great? And it was very difficult. But I had to go and kill off the old guy, right? The old soldier. I had to kill him off and birth the new guy. And the new guy
Mm-hmm.
got to own up to this new frontier that I'm stepping into, this new world that I'm trying to create. And it was a little bit challenging, because oftentimes I was looking at, I have this vision, this big vision I want to pursue. But then in that same space, I was looking at all these obstacles that's going to prevent me from doing it. And it
Mm-hmm.
makes a lot of paralysis in that process, because I'm like, I'm seeing the obstacle. I can't get to the vision because the obstacle is in my way. Versus, like, really just look at the vision, and then after the vision is clear, you go into it, and whatever obstacle you get help getting there. And it
Mm-hmm.
was very challenging to get through. So yeah.
I think that, first of all, again, I want to thank you on air for your service. I think
Oh,
people that are in the service of the military are brave and capable beyond what I was brave and capable of. And so thank you for your service. You said the word enough, and you said it so beautifully. And I want to point to the way you said it.
mm,
Have I done enough? Or I question whether I've done enough. One of the biggest struggles that I try to help people with is the idea of enough
mm,
gets to be positioned as something that you have or do, never who you are. And it's a very small language shift. But I was giving a talk in Dallas in the summertime of last year, and it was a beautiful talk about passion and purpose, and how we create the life that we want to live, and live our most contented, most joyful life with the massive amount of impact we want to create. And I got a couple questions at the end, and then this beautiful, beautiful Black woman stood up and said, all right, I'll ask the question that everybody else here is thinking that nobody's willing to ask. With all this empowerment, all this sort of inspiration, how do you deal with the crushing imposter syndrome? that so
Mm.
many of us face. And I told her that I saw her for the hard work that she's doing and for being an entrepreneur and for raising children that she had told me about. And I said to her, "Are you enough?" And it wasn't until after that talk that I realized what a bullshit question. Oh, I don't know if I can cuss. What a BS question that is. What a BS question that was. Now, she paused, Asher, and I said, "That's a no. You don't believe in yourself when you consider whether you're enough or not." And it was in that moment that I realized it was a BS question. It is a bait question. It is a trick question, because you existing on this earth, putting one foot in front of the other and breathing air makes you intrinsically enough. You
Mhm.
can't possibly be less than enough. And so, from forever and always, from that moment forward, I encouraged her to remember that she is enough. She is always enough. In fact, if anything, she's too much for some people. And that's why we don't show up and shine bright and get loud and be clear and take up massive space. We downplay it because we're like, oh, well, I may be enough, but I certainly don't want to be too much. And we're in this constant balance and battle that it feels like a losing battle. It's a battle and a war you can't win until you realize I am enough. I get to question if I've done enough. Am I smart enough? Am I experienced enough? All those things, because those are things we can do. If I
Mhm.
don't have enough money, I get to earn more money. If I am not smart enough on this thing, I get to go take a course or learn from a mentor. If I and the beat goes on. But when it comes to knowing that you're enough and that you can never be too much, everything changes. The frailty disappears, the freedom grows, and I'll end it with one other kind of funny story to bring it home. I remember doing a workshop, and the woman says, "Well, I'm just worried because I feel like I'm too much all the time." And one time, this one coworker told me that it's not professional to be the way that I am, and I asked her to, "Well, I'm really bubbly, I'm really personal, like I'm a hugger, and so like I don't like to shake hands. I want to work with my clients and hug them, and I use emojis all the time." And they said it wasn't professional. And I was like, "Oh, okay, so you're too much." She's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Yeah, you're too much for them." She's like, "Yeah." And
Mhm.
suddenly you saw this shift that what we realize is when people think we're too much, Asher, it typically is telling us more about them than it's telling about us. And we don't get to play down. We don't get to dim our light. We don't get to not use emojis. And it was so beautiful. It was so funny. We were laughing because she's like, "I'm going to use emojis anywhere, everywhere, all the time." And I was like, "Good. You can be the emoji person," right? Like, she's so bubbly. She's so fun. And if people don't like that, that's a them problem, not a her problem.
Wow, that was powerful. Thank you for sharing. And that took me back to a conversation I had with my friend too. We was talking about just like our upbringing and stuff. And she said something to me that kind of stood out. She was saying that growing up, she used to like dumb down herself so she can fit into the group.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, I knew I was smarter than most of those kids, but I wanted to be friends with them. So I kind of like just dumbed down myself so I can fit in. But that ended up affecting that ended up being a behavior over time where she still do the same thing until she
Mm-hmm.
realized, oh, you know what? Actually, I'm very smart. I need to start owning that piece and stepping up into that new circle of folks that are operating at the same level. But it's interesting you said that because a lot of us do the same. And it's like if I'm still breathing life, that means life thinks I'm still enough. I'm good enough to still be here. So I'm gonna do what I can, while I can, right? But a lot of us, like I went through that stuff. I had low self-esteem for a long time, and that stemmed from my challenge with the symptom of ADD and dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
And like you say, you would naturally speaking, like me naturally speaking was like one of the biggest challenges because I stumble over my words and
Mm-hmm.
all these other things. I didn't have to read. Grammar was the hardest thing for me to learn. So then I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really share my thoughts about my creativity with writing. I didn't share that because grammar, I just couldn't master that piece of it. And then I didn't want to speak much because I would just speak bad English. Because I mean, I came from Jamaica. I didn't really pursue real English until I got to America. I was like, man, I really need to learn English. Like in Jamaica, we get to speak the other thing. I'm good with it. But
Yeah.
so I had to relearn English. But when I joined the military, I kind of like, I speak, but then I realized, like, Asher, say that again. What you say? I'm like, ah, man. So after a while, I start eating that, like, okay, I keep speaking, but they don't get what I'm saying. So then after a while, like, I'm not going to say anything. So that put me in a
Mm.
space of shutting up. I'm
Yeah.
like, God, I really got to work on speaking. Got to learn English. I got to learn how to write. I got to learn how to speak. So then I really go after this thing. My writing vocabulary, my thinking, and my speaking vocabulary, I got to work on these. I already know I was a great thinker. Like my whole life, I know I was a great thinker, but writing and speaking, those other two was my biggest Hercules heel. I just felt like I was always defeated. So it affected my self-esteem for a long time. But then I realized I'm start looking at other people that see the same kind of qualities that I want to embody. I'm like, man, I want to be just like that person. As good as speaking and just communicating like that person do. I gotta go after it. I gotta start practicing.
Mm-hmm.
After that, I start facing those symptoms, start working at tools, finding tools to work at them. And after a while, I start, sometimes people say you can't do confidence. You can only feel it, but you get to do courage. You get to be courageous in certain things, and from doing that courageous thing, you gain confidence after from the practice. So I had to learn how to be courageous in certain things because I've realized how powerful courage is once you start doing it. So you do
Mm-hmm.
courage and you feel confident. What are
And
your
and
thoughts?
I'm gonna add another C to
Mm-hmm.
that, and that's clarity.
Mm-hmm.
You found clarity in who you were, but the things that you didn't necessarily like. And I think this is a beautiful thing. So I said earlier that it's my mission in life to use the spoken and written word to
Mm-hmm.
help people love themselves unconditionally and live unapologetically. Which means, if we use you as an example, Asher, and I hope that's okay,
Yes.
you could say, I love myself, but I don't like that my diction, because of my home country, makes it hard for people to understand me. So I'm going to work on my grammar and my diction, not to eliminate the Jamaican history in me and heritage, but to make it so it's easier for people to understand me. That clarity helped you find that courage and confidence in tandem. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the struggle is there's a lot of people that position that. And again, these are small, these are the small details that make a huge difference. I literally have coached people that were immigrants or had accents that are like, I don't want people to know that I'm from the islands.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I sound too female, too black, too from the islands, too Caribbean, too uneducated, too Southern. And they literally change their diction to try to make it so that other people's preconceived notion of whatever that part of them is isn't so obvious. And that's, like you said, that's how we lose confidence. That's how we start being quieter, saying less,
Mm-hmm.
and depriving the world of what we truly have to offer. So when we find clarity and understanding around the fact that we get to be exactly who we are everywhere we go with whomever we're with, and if they have preconceived notions, and I think again about your grammar and when you would somebody would not be understanding you, depending on the experience you have with that person, if you lack clarity, confidence, and courage, like we just talked about, you'll be in a position where if that person gets frustrated with you, you'll internalize it rather than externalize it, right? If I were standing with you, Asher, and we were having, first of all, I love everything about your culture and I love everything about your diction and I love your accent. I love your hat. I love your vibe. I love how you show up. I love you for everything you are and everything you're creating. And
Mm-hmm.
if I was standing with you and you were talking to us and that person in any way exhibited frustration, a lack of patience, a roll of the eyes, a sigh, because they have to work a little harder to understand exactly what you're saying through your grammar or diction or pronunciation, I would be sure to remind them that you moved here from another country, learned the culture, served this country, and are now serving other people so that you get to have a massive impact on others that learn through your story. What have they done lately? It might help them understand that their lack of patience, their lack of willing to lean in and do the work with someone, again, says a lot more about them and their frustration maybe with themselves. People tend to believe that if someone is out of their orbit, they get to pull them back down rather than rocket ship up. And that's a bummer, right? And I do everything I can to never witness that. Someone might look at you, Asher, and be like, well, look what Asher's accomplished. He's moved to America. He's become a part of this culture. He's retained his heritage. He's served this country. He's written books. He's hosting a podcast. He's got a YouTube channel. Yeah, but he's hard to understand. They got
Mm-hmm.
to do whatever they can to pull you down. And that's not okay. And so I think that when we find clarity in who we are and we find that capacity to say, I'm just going to live unapologetically. And again, my saying is this: you get to show up, shine bright, get loud, be clear, take up massive space. And if other people have a problem with that, if that's inconvenient for them, that's a them problem, not a you problem.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. That means a lot, by the way. That means a lot. And definitely, yes, sir, because the American population was worth my sacrifice. And while I was in this, the big question that kind of drive my life, I keep sharing this was, who do you want to be a hero to, Asher? And at the time, it was the American population, American family, because it was worth my sacrifice. And now, same thing. My focus now is the same question: who do I want to be a hero to now? And those are the immigrants and veterans community. And those are the folks that I'm focused on really, really empowering as much as I can because I realize how that feels when you like have to move. Like people don't understand how difficult it is to switch identities. I'm gonna go here for a bit because I think you can understand that piece. It's very difficult to switch identities. And so when I leave Jamaica, came to America, I had to figure out how do I didn't want to assimilate all the way, right? I want to still kind of like work my way into stuff. But then when I joined the military, it was good to have that brotherhood because they kind of help you assimilate, okay, into that culture, those value system in the military, kind of embody those principles, so forth and so on. You had the brotherhood. So then I had to help moving into that identity. But then after I retired from the military, no, I'm leaving that identity to a new one. That was not easy again because now leaving the military, I didn't have that same brotherhood to kind of nourish me back into a new identity. So then I felt like I was cut off, right? So now didn't have the community to help me grow into because you create a new identity, which means you're a baby now again. And a baby needs a nourishing community to kind of bring them back up into life again, right? And I notice how big difference it is when you switch identities. And sometimes people don't see how hard it is. If you don't have the support, if nobody edify you, everybody just criticize you and bring you down, then no edification piece of it, then you're gonna fall into a hole, right? So I was noticing all of that. So I'm like, okay, so now what can I do now to empower immigrants and veterans, those that are switching identity, transition from a different identity, what that feels like, and what can they do to be edified into that new space they want to own?
Mm,
And that was very, very difficult. But now I see the power of it. And I see how it's necessary to have a community around you that supports you when you're moving from one identity to the next. What are your
yes.
thoughts?
So identity is so important. I mean, it's a cornerstone of the work that I do.
Mm-hmm.
I believe genuinely that, to your point, we I make a joke. The future is fluid, like me, right? I'm talking about my gender fluidity, but the future is always fluid from a perspective of we have no idea what's on the horizon,
Mm-hmm.
and as we do the hard work of shining a light in and learning more about ourselves and how we get to show up in the world, what the world sees and how we want to be seen, and all those wonderful things that make up who we are, there is no rigidity to it unless people choose rigidity, right?
Mm-hmm.
You always have a choice. And to your point, a lot of the people I work with are people that are coming out as part of the LGBTQIA2 plus community. A lot of the people I work with are getting married or getting divorced. A lot of the people I work with are changing careers or taking their best effort at entrepreneurship. You are a beautiful example of the idea that we are always becoming, right? And I'm going to get back to community in one hot second, but it was recently where I started talking about, I literally wrote down, I want, just because, I think I sound pretty sure of myself
Mm-hmm.
as I'm speaking and when I do these podcast interviews, I literally wrote down and stared at the blinking cursor for a little while, and I'm 36 or some odd thousand words in, just just kind of throwing it on the page and deciding what it's going to look like when it's done, and going through all the things that you know about, right?
Mm-hmm.
The it's a terrible example, but like the childbirth that is writing a book. It literally typed out, what am I even doing? Because I was having sort of a crisis of confidence, and is anybody actually going to read this, and am I really telling my story beautifully enough where people will be engaged and want to read it? And I realized something. I realized at that moment that I reminded myself that I'm not necessarily writing a book for that book to be popular, to be bought, to be a bestseller, although I believe it will, because I think it's going to be relevant and people are going to want to hear it. I'm doing it to go through the process of writing. The
Mm-hmm.
writing in and of itself is the main goal. The publishing a book and, finding my way to stages and to people's hearts and minds, that's the byproduct of the writing. And so what I wrote was, I'm overcoming so that I can become. And what I started thinking about is, becoming is a never ending. We don't ever like, okay, I'm here, I'm done, I'm fully baked, there's nothing else to be done until the day we draw our last breath. I believe that we are always becoming. And to your point of changing identities and changing communities, that's because we have a notion or an idea that there's a part of us that gets to be explored. I'm going to leave the military. What's next? Who do I
Mm-hmm.
now become? What part of me changes? And I think the important part about community is yes, to your point, always have to have it. Next thing is, it may not be who you think it will be.
Mm-hmm.
So I read this in a book, and I've read like 4 books in the last month, and so I'm not certain which book it was, but it was beautiful and a very, I think, well-held belief. People don't always see us who we are. They either see us sort of as who they want to see us as or who we were, right? And so I'm sure you speak from experience. Potentially, as you left the military, there were lifers maybe that were in the military that were like, okay, well, Asher's leaving the military. He's not one of us anymore, and you maybe lost some connections or lost some depth to your relationship. When I came out as non-binary and started to explore my gender identity, my expression, and showing up as the real and authentic me, I think there were a lot of people that just didn't have time or space for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that they would be there to hold my hand and to help me through and to ask questions. And a good number of them weren't, and that's okay. That's a choice they get to make. But it brought into, I think, really clear perspective that just because somebody has been doesn't mean they always will be a part of
Mm-hmm.
that community. And the last thing is, communities typically have leaders, and those leaders are the people that are willing to be strong in a way that so many people think is weak. And that's through transparency and vulnerability, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you write your story and you talk about, I'm sure, the moments of weakness, the moments of fear, the moments of concern, the moments of uh, inability to decide, whatever it is, it becomes relevant and relative to people's lives. And they look to you as a leader to say, if you did that thing, if you navigated that thing, I can do that too. And what that requires is for you to be the person who goes up and is the nail that sticks out. I don't know if you've heard that, right? A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are worried about being the nail that sticks up, because what happens? It gets hammered down. But I believe that leaders are superheroes, and that the thing that they think is their kryptonite is really their superpower. And guess what, Asher? Hammers don't work on superheroes. So don't worry about it. Just go out and, what do I say, right? Go up, show up, shine bright, be loud, get clear, and take up massive space. Be the nail that stands up. Don't worry about the hammers. They don't work on you. And make sure that as you lead, your kryptonite, it's actually your superpower. Put on your red cape, go out and change the world.
Wow, that was incredible. Hmm. A few things popped up for me just now. Let me think about it real fast. And the leader piece hits me. And but there's a quote, I think it was J.R. Ridinger have this quote. It says, "We all have to achieve our dreams so others can really realize their dreams or believe in their dreams," right? Something like that. And it's very powerful when you think about it, because I'm looking back. I know there's a lot of people watching this. Like I know, right? And eventually they're gonna see, oh, if Ash should pull it out, because oftentimes what happened is, I noticed when I was leaving the military, there was a really good track for employment, right? But there was not a lot of track for deployment. I mean, like deployment of my skill. So I can find employment, but deployment of my skill wasn't, the system wasn't as clean and smooth as it was for employment. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna figure this thing out, because I want to deploy my skill set that I haven't been able to use while I was in the military, because I'm following the system. So I'm following the system until the system is time is up. I want to do something different now. What's new system? So I didn't see that. But then you mentioned something about leading, and I love that place, because I think there's always a state, and every state needs a leader, right? So the state that you decide to occupy in that space that need a leader. And oftentimes I'm talking about either state of poverty, state of richness, state, whatever state that exists, every state need a leader. Just like every land state need a leader, every mental state need a leader, all the other places need a leader. And
Mm-hmm.
it needs somebody to step up and lead that state. And I feel like, okay, I'm gonna rise to the top and do the same thing. Step up in that state and lead it. And right now, the state I'm leaving is the state I'm occupying right now. And that's my space. I'm gonna lead it. So I appreciate you saying that, by the way.
I love everything about that. I think that being a leader does take that strength that most people think is a weakness. They see vulnerability and transparency and stepping out as like, I don't want people to think I'm weak. Vulnerability is a strength unlike any other,
Mhm.
and I can't even imagine the countless number of people that followed you on your journey and are using you as a beacon of light, right? I tell people that when you shine bright, you're a beacon. And some people will get close and they'll be like, I'm not about this. That's
Mhm.
fine. That's fine. Go a different direction. Everybody gets to choose. But but for the countless people. And the thing that I love about you, it reminds me of my grandfather. My grandfather was one of the ones that broke the mold. He was an amazing human. We lost him way too soon, but one of the things that I was taught by him was perseverance, persistence, and adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
He was an entrepreneur his whole life. He got out of World War II and he started an ice house. And this ice house was where they would store ice for ice boxes because they didn't have refrigeration yet. And then what happened? Refrigerators put him out of business.
Mm-hmm.
So he started a beer distributor in like soda pop house because people needed cold beer and cold sodas and they were going on picnics and to put them in their new Frigidaires. And then what put him out of business? Supermarkets. And he continued to basically evolve until he was in his mid 60s and he finally retired. But he never stopped. And he was on his path of entrepreneurship. And I think all too often people see their path as a rut,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the rut that your tire of your bike gets set into. And then you just follow it where it's going because you're in that rut and it takes work and it takes effort to pull out of that rut so you can turn in a direction, any direction you want. And so you as a leader, you as a persistent individual who's chasing passions and purposes, realize that I'm on a path. I'm not in a rut. I get to choose where I go. And what that does is it beats a path for people to potentially follow or not follow and just say, if Asher created a path, I can do the same thing. So when they get to that big, hairy, audacious goal that looks like a jungle that is as of yet uncarved, they know because of your inspiration, I can do it too. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Mm. I have one book recommendation for the folks that are listening right now, because you just mentioned it, just kind of hit me just now. And the book title is Who Owns the Ice House? And that's interesting. It's a very good book. You can check. The author is Gary G. Scorninger. I don't know. I can't even pronounce his last name, but Gary G. S. Who Owns the Ice House? Pretty good book. Folks that are listening. So we gotta wrap up there. Don, this has been an interesting conversation, by the way. So thank you for the generous use of your time and your intellect and your energy. Appreciate you showing up today and just kind of giving us what you got. And if you had my closing question, let me ask you that closing question first. My closing question often is, what is that one thing or two thing when people do it drive you crazy? If you had to share that, what would that be?
People, we've kind of already talked about them. Self-deprecation, in my opinion,
Mhm.
because I know that what people are trying to do is maybe make an uncomfortable situation comfortable. But
Mhm.
when people self-deprecate, which essentially means they sort of talk down or talk bad about themselves, that is the number one biggest thing. And then this other one is, again, it's sort of similar, but when we realize that there's something that we don't like about ourselves, we allow it to impact how much we think we love ourselves, right? And so I talk about that we get to love ourselves unconditionally. And there's lots of things I don't necessarily like about myself, things that I want to change, things that I want to grow, but I don't allow that to be something that I talk about. And so, like, if you're out there and you're listening, which I'm pretty sure you are because you can hear my voice right now,
Mm-hmm.
be kind to yourself, love yourself unconditionally, live your life unapologetically, and yeah, that's it. That's all I got.
How can people find you?
It's really, really complicated. You got to go to the website, donmamone.com. That's my first and last name. I'm sure you can put that in the show notes, but I'm Don Mamone everywhere online. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. Go to my website. You can send me a note. I respond to all my DMs. I really and genuinely am a relationship person, so feel free to reach out to me at any time.
Cool. What is your biggest takeaway from this conversation today?
Number one, that you're an amazing human, that I appreciate the work that you're doing, that I say with, again, a great deal of pride and humility, that I'm closer to where I've ever been to knowing my full and sort of focused purpose. You said earlier depth. You
Mm-hmm.
liked the depth of this conversation, and that meant a lot to me because I think that in years past, and as I tried to chase lower P passions, right, just things that we like to do, things that are really great in our life, things that we want to work at, I was losing sight of the capital P purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And this year, my focus has been on depth over breadth and intention and focus. And so to say that you liked the depth of this conversation means a lot to me. And so that's where we're headed, I think.
Excellent. Folks, again, if you're catching this on live, go and put hashtag live in the chat. If you're catching this on replay, go and put hashtag replay in the chat. And you tune in Pandora's Awareness Podcast, a place where we collect stories and circulate life-changing wisdom. And you definitely got some wisdom from Don and myself today having this conversation around first-time experiences and what they mean to us and how we have navigated them throughout our life and how we using those to advise the world. So again, thank you so much for the generous use of your time, Don. Any last word before we go?
Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. It is my goal and my intention and my wish to get into the hearts and minds of many people out there. So thank you for sharing your audience with me.
All right, with that, folks, make it an awesome week.